We recently had a discussion on the purges of the left in the British Labour Party. The presenters were Tina Workman of the Labour Left Alliance, Pam Bromley, an expelled former Labour Party member, city councillor, and John Dunn, lifelong Labour Party member and former striking British coal miner. The discussion started off with Tina referring to the rise of Jeremy Corbyn.
He had to be nominated by MPs, parliamentarians, and none of them expected him to win, but he did in a landslide, and that brought a lot of left-wingers and socialists and communists and Marxists back into the Labour Party, or into the Labour Party for the first time, and it exploded. Comrades will have heard it when, it's like 350,000 people, I think, joined when he was elected, and it was a massive sort of sense of hope going through the British left, and it was fantastic. But very, very quickly it transpired that I believe there was a lack of a sense of self-defeat that led to this slow defeat of Corbyn over 5 years. And I'll get to that. But I think the fact that he has been defeated is causing shockwaves still. And he's been truly defeated now. He's gone. He's still suspended from the Parliamentary Labour Party. Some people think he will be expelled from the Labour Party, which is entirely possible. I'm not 100% sure, but it can happen. So the left in the Labour Party has been left totally defeated. Worse than that, though, this defeat has spread far further than the British left in the Labour Party. It's spread into society, mainly to do with the unfortunate fact that the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn surrendered when it came to the IRA misdefinition of anti-Semitism, which I'm sure comrades are familiar with, because that's having repercussions in the US as well, where I believe under Trump was making noises about banning NGOs that are anti-Semitic according to the IRA misdefinition, etc. So in Britain, you've seen attacks on academic freedom. Just recently, just last week, since David Miller, professor, spoke at one of our meetings in favor of free speech, was critical of Zionism, and there is now a massive attack on him to get him to lose his job and be fired from his university. And they're all piling in, right-wing MPs, people on his university, right-wingers from across Britain. But I think this is spread not just into wider society, it's spread further than Britain as well. It's spread into Germany, France. This is going on everywhere, which actually shows that it had something to do with Corbyn, but not just. I think we often underestimate the role that Israel has played in this, and the Israeli government has played in all of this. They had been concerned, and you can look back, long before Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, there had been a massive concern over the growth and the success of the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement in the US, in Germany, and Britain. It became really quite something, and critical of what Israel is doing in Palestine, etc. There was then a sort of coincidence, if you wish, then when the pro-Palestinian campaigner Corbyn was elected. I think the Israeli government was very, very aware in how dangerous that situation could become should he become prime minister. There would be no support for any more military adventures in the Middle East, for example. There would be no uncritical support for Israel, as Tony Blair, for example, had shown, and other Labour leaders. So they threw, really, the Israeli government threw everything they had at stopping Corbyn and the left. And you can watch the lobby on Al Jazeera for some of the evidence, but it's quite clear they formed propaganda departments that had the sole purpose of undermining and finding crap and making up crap about Corbyn. And this was, of course, welcomed with open arms by the right in the British establishment and the media. They did everything in their power to stop Corbyn becoming PM. Media onslaught was ridiculous in Britain. I mean, every single thing they threw at him from morning to night. Most of it made up, some true, some not so true, etc. And the right in the Labour Party, of course, was also very keen on getting rid of him. And I think it's quite important in that context to understand what the British Labour Party is. It's quite different, obviously, and you know, comrades know that from the Democrats or any other sort of Labourite party in the US. The British Labour Party was characterized by Lenin in 1921 as a bourgeois workers' party, a bourgeois pole and a workers' pole, because the unions are affiliated, they remain affiliated to the Labour Party. They pay most of the bills of the Labour Party. At Labour Party conference, they have 50% of the votes, which can be quite tricky because it's not the members or even the elected delegates voting at conference. It is the general secretary says what goes, and then all the delegates have to, like minions, they have to vote in accordance to what the general secretary told them. So there's a lot of issues with that. But as opposed to Democrats, the Labour Party has a working class wing, and a lot of people see the Labour Party as their natural home. And that, on the other side, of course, the establishment, the bourgeoisie, wants to have a second 11, like a second football team they can rely on if the Tories, the Conservative Party, can't deliver, or tearing themselves apart over something. You need to have a reliable second team that could take over. So there's a constant attack. There was a constant attack from day one, and it's easy to sort of lay all the blame on Corbyn, and some people have, most of them actually still defend Corbyn to the hills. I think there's a huge role it's played. I think mistakes made by the Corbyn leadership, and we can't underestimate them. The point is not to diss Corbyn, but that we learn some lessons, that if we ever get into a situation like that again, we have to just make sure this never happens again, that we're being trashed so much. And I think the main issue was that from day one, Corbyn was dead set on maintaining unity with the openly capitalist right in the trade union and in the labor bureaucracy, all in the name of winning elections, which then he thought, and they said it, he said it, John McDonnell said it, once we've got our foot in Downing Street number 10, once we're in government, then we can really show what we're about and establish a socialist government, with our socialist program, et cetera, et cetera. But to get there, I mean, they made one step back after another, dropping the decades-old demand for the right of Labour Party members to decide who their local representative in Parliament should be. They dropped that, so it didn't get through at conference. Refusing to call out the lie that anti-Zionism is the same as anti-Semitism, and of course adopting the awful IRA misdefinition of anti-Semitism, which was done under Corbyn. And in fact, I mean, it has to be said that under Corbyn, shamefully, General Secretary Jenny Formby, it became a disciplinary offence to merely deny or question that the Labour Party has a huge problem with anti-Semitism. That became an offence, and it was called denialism, which really smacks of sort of Salem witch hunting. You cannot win in that situation. So to deny that there is a huge problem with anti-Semitism makes you an anti-Semite. You say there is no huge problem, then you are the problem, which is, of course, led to all sorts of, Kafkaesque, ridiculous developments. And the biggest victim was Chris Williamson, the only MP, the only parliamentarian who ever stood up to this idiotic, self-defeating campaign. In my view, this show must show to us, to the left, that appeasement rarely works, really. It can sometimes, but clearly it didn't in the Labour Party. Clearly, if you carry on doing the same thing over and over again, you take a step back and you let Jackie Walker being attacked, you let Mark Wadsworth being attacked, and you say nothing. Every step back you take, the right is kind of saying take one or two steps forwards, of course. And after a while, you should really see if that clearly doesn't work and it doesn't stop the right, but makes them only stronger, stop your campaign, stop tactics, change tactics. But it didn't, he didn't. He carried on, zero tolerance is the latest thing they just before Corbyn was suspended, I think they went for the zero tolerance, any any hint of you being an anti-Semite or having said something anti-Semitic, and you're out. We can't have any discussions, we can't have any rational debate, you can't have any appeals, you're out, zero tolerance. And that Corbyn then ended up himself as a victim is kind of the logical outcome, of course. Under Corbyn, people got suspended for saying exactly the same that he was suspended for, i.e. that, saying that anti-Semitism had been weaponized, and clearly it had. Had he stopped that in its track and called it out for the lie that it was, I think we could be in quite a different situation. I don't think we would live in a socialist society, as I think some people often had some tremendous illusions in what Corbyn could achieve, or what a Labour Party government in a capitalist society can achieve. And that was, I think, is part of the problem, really. I think that a lot of people just went with it, we just have to get the Labour Party elected, we just have to get in, and then Corbyn can unleash socialism, which is, of course, a profound misunderstanding, I think, or self-delusion about what socialism is. It's the Labour Party is a reflection of the class struggle, no doubt, but in order, you can't have socialism delivered by Parliament in a society. Even if the Labour Party had won, if Corbyn had won with, say, 42% of the electoral vote, that still would not translate to the vast majority of the working class that you need to establish any kind of idea of socialism, let alone, it needs to be international, of course. And, we're not in a period where that is actually possible at the moment, with working class struggles so low, etc. And even if Corbyn had set out to make massive changes to society, I don't think he would have been allowed to do that. He would have, there's been not only the media being controlled by the right, etc. The secret state is another reason. There were army generals who announced they would mutiny should he become prime minister, etc. You really need the vast majority of people behind you to avoid things like that, to avoid the army, getting rid of you. And, they have various methods of doing this. Obviously, it's not no problem for them. So, for me anyway, I think this period really has shown that socialists should not actually try and run capitalist societies. It's every time they've tried it, it's gone really, really badly wrong. Marx has written about Mitterrand in France, the left, and there's examples like the Left Party in Germany. Wherever it's been in government, it's been really, basically helped to defeat and to attack the working class, and, closing libraries, closing down, kindergartens, etc. It was Rifondazione Comunista in Italy, Syriza in Greece, etc. These are, in our recent past is littered with examples of what happens to socialists when you try and run governments like that. So that you end up attacking the working class sooner or later. So I'm not saying that we should fight against the Labour Party winning elections. Obviously, that would be daft. But to believe that this would lead to kind of some kind of socialism, it's just utterly delusional. What we should have concentrated more as the left is the rules, the Labour Party itself's rules and how the Labour Party works. We could have had quite a revolution in the Labour Party, and that matters because of the unique position of the Labour Party in the British working class, I think, and how linked they still are to it. But the only time, unfortunately, Corbyn looked at some rules, he made them worse for the left. And I think just before the last Labour Party conference, the left, NEC, and with Corbyn's support, pushed through fast-track expulsions, for example, and it's into the rule book, which we're now all, that's now the preferred method to get rid of people without a right to appeal, etc. So it's unfortunately instead of looking at these things, how to make the Labour Party, which are still over 400,000, close to 500,000 people in it, how to, make that into something that can actually be ours, get rid of the bureaucracy, the regions, they're still run by people who've been appointed, never elected, appointed by the right, rather looking at how we can change that machinery and make it sort of serve us and serve us as a left in the next 20, 30 years. That's what Tony Blair did when he took over the Labour Party. He revolutionized the party. He threw out the left. He changed everything. He made the conference into the talking shop that is today. And when Corbyn came back, he didn't correct any of those things. They didn't even talk about it. All it was about elections and getting your foot in the door, and then there will be, the next disappointment for the working class. So, as I said, I'm not saying all of these things because I think Jeremy Corbyn was a bad guy. He's a really lovely guy by all accounts, and I've met him a few times as well. He's actually a bit boring. He's a hippie, a peacenik hippie. That's who he is. He's not the Messiah, and it's still, I still can't quite believe how many people see him as that. He's launched this Corbyn project, Peace and Solidarity or something, which is just, it's got no democracy. It's just a sort of think tank, and tens of thousands of people, even those who've been witch hunted, look at this, like this might be some, we have to join that. That's going to be great. That's going to be great. It's just, so many people have learned nothing from our defeat, from this, what was really a historic defeat for the left, not just in Britain, but internationally, I think. And I'm involved. I mean, it's very easy to get demoralized, and it has to be said, most of the left is deeply demoralized in this period, and we're all really struggling hard to overcome that. But I think it's really important to think about the bigger picture here, and educating ourselves and just learning some lessons to make sure that we're better prepared next time. And we will, I mean, Marx and Engels and all these people, they said it much better than I ever could, but we will be defeated again and again and again until we're actually able to win. I think at the moment we're clearly totally incapable of grabbing the opportunities, the very few opportunities that we're given, but that was a huge opportunity that I think we've squandered. So where I'm involved in chiefly the Labour Left Alliance and Labour Against the Witch Hunt, we are trying to use this period now to regather our forces, talk about what went wrong and be honest about it, because much of the left, unfortunately, will not do that. Momentum is, I'm sure that people even in America have heard about a Momentum, which was the biggest left organization that was set up, but it totally failed the test. The John Lansman, who used to run it, was actively involved in the witch hunt against the left, against Jackie Walker and others. It's slightly better now, he's gone, but there's the new leaders, I don't think, have learned much about what to do better and how to stand up to the witch hunt. They're very selective in which parts of the witch hunt they oppose. They will support anybody who's standing up for Jeremy Corbyn now. Those are the people they defend. They won't defend people like Pam, people like Tony Greenstein, Jackie Walker, etc. They're left, these other slightly, unhygienic victims of the witch hunt, because it's had anti-Semitism about it. So they're remaining quiet about anything that happened there, and there's no attempt to learn anything from that defeat. So we have to play a long game. We have to understand that, winning elections is not going to be the answer. It's about equipping the whole of the working class, and having the working class actually understand what's going on. It also means not looking to a messiah. And unfortunately, Corbyn never challenged that. It was a terrible messiah cult atmosphere there. And I think most of the left still suffers from that and is unable to move forward to that. But I also think we have to understand that internationalism is really important, and active working class internationalism, which is again not something the Corbyn leadership really did. And I think that became quite clear over the disaster that was their position on Brexit. It was all about British interests and British this, and nothing about the unity, the positive vision of unity of the working class, not just in Europe but internationally. And I'm not a fan of the European Union, quite far from it. But to be unable to have any kind of proper links with socialists across Europe or the globe is a huge is a huge problem for us. And that's why I welcome meetings like that very much, where we can actually, see what we have in common and how we can talk to each other and educate each other as well, because there's a lot to be learned from each other.
Go ahead, Pam.
Right, yeah, I mean, that was an excellent resume by Tina of what's actually going on. It's difficult to think of anything I can add, really, but I mean, I think the reality was the ruling class absolutely terrified at the success of Jeremy Corbyn, and absolutely terrified about the number of people that supported Corbyn in Momentum. And basically what they've done, they've thrown every single thing at it, every power of the state against it, to try and overcome it. And at the moment, unfortunately, they've had a victory, which we'll have to see what happens, won't we? And it's not the end of the matter. But more, I was going to talk about my own experiences. I mean, Tina mentioned Kafka, and that's exactly what it is. I'm glad she mentioned Kafka, because I read Kafka in my teens, and this is it exactly. I finally understand the trial. So basically, I'm a councillor of a very tiny borough called Rosendale. I was elected as a Labour councillor in 2016 by a very right-wing party, but at the time, Corbyn was on the ascendancy, and we were all hopeful that he would get into office, and we would be there carrying out Labour policies in the local council. And we were also developing a left wing in our local Labour Party as well. So all in all, it seemed a good idea to volunteer to be a councillor for that reason. So I stood in what was considered to be a Tory seat, and I wasn't expected to win it, and I did, which surprised everybody, really. I mean, it wasn't me that won it; it was the local party. We put a lot of work in. So all was well for a bit, and then I'm posting away on social media, and I inadvertently shared an anti-Semitic meme. Now, at the time, there's a whole load of fuss about the Rothschilds family. When all this started, I had no idea the Rothschild were Jewish. I'd never thought about it. And the meme appeared to be criticising big business. Anyway, up it went, and a Jewish friend of mine got on, "What are you doing, blah, 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 blah." And we're quite upset to about it. He actually explained what it was, and I took it down. Then after that, I made some comments about it. Now, one of the comments I made, and this is something that I think is lost on a lot of the left, is that the Rothschilds may be a wealthy family, but they're no worse than any other wealthy family. And as such, all in a sense are equal. Now, that's not anti-Semitism, that's the opposite. And even my manager at work could see that. But anyway, this has started an absolute storm against me. At first, I was suspended by the Labour Party with no warning. The press knew before I did. And they investigated me. And it wasn't just about that, it was all sorts of stuff, because I'd mentioned Marx and various other remarks. It was quite a range of things. You could see what they were driving at, that I was quite obviously a very left-wing councillor, and I very vocally supported Jeremy Corbyn, and I think that's why they came for me. So that's the first thing that happened. And then after a battle for a year, I finally managed to get a hearing, and I got reinstated, but still another 6 months out of the Labour group. This is for a remark that is the opposite of anti-Semitism. This is the crazy thing about it. But while that went on, there was a horrendous media campaign against me. There was all sorts of smears and lies going on. I was being bombarded by journalists and so on. Absolute. This is a fairly ordinary councillor. I mean, I had no particular responsibilities or anything. And that this is how they reacted to it. But of course, that's indicative of how they've treated everybody in the Labour Party since, that perfectly ordinary people say one thing that they don't like, and that's it gets investigated. So anyway, back in the Labour Party for a little while, and then I see the baby there, and then the next thing, when we got to the point where Chris Williamson was suspended, I started to defend Chris Williamson very publicly on social media, and started to say that the accusations against anti-Semitism in the Labour Party were bogus, which by and large they are. I'm still waiting to see an example of one genuine act of thought of anti-Semitism, because this is not about this. This is about criticism of Israel. So the second time I was suspended again was really over this. Was defending Chris Williamson and accusations of anti-Semitism. So the second time round, I decided not to cooperate with the investigation because all the evidence is based on screen prints of computers. Well, they're editable images. They're just not. They're not evidence really. So I refused to cooperate anyway. So then I became victim of the fast track expulsion, and I was out 5 minutes later. So that was the end of the Labour Party as far as I was concerned. But while, of course, all this was going on, the European Human Rights Commission had essentially been persuaded by Labour against anti-Semitism, and the Board of Deputies and all the Israeli business groups really to investigate the Labour Party for anti-Semitism, which they did, and they finished up producing this appalling report, absolutely ridiculous report, in which myself and Ken Livingstone were declared to have illegally harassed Jews, and we were sort of held up to be the two people in the country in the Labour Party that are responsible for this harassment of Jews. So absolute nonsense, absolutely ridiculous. So what's happened since then is Chris Williamson set up a Left Legal Fighting Fund to fight his own case, which he wanted his suspension overturned and only to be suspended again. So he got costs for it. So that's now formed the basis of the Left Legal Fighting Fund. So we then decided that we would go to the High Court about it. So the situation at the moment is I'm being funded by the Left Legal Fighting Fund to take action in the High Court to ask for a judicial review, because on a couple of points, the things that they've put in are not legal. To do with the right to free speech. So we're hoping to, I think they're quite optimistic we're going to win that. So that's me really in a nutshell. What has really angered me though is that because of the distorted way that my remarks have been presented, that it's leaked into some areas of the left, and people actually now think I have said an anti-Semitic statement which I haven't made. I've said the opposite, and that's the latest thing that's actually really galled me, that people on the left can't see it for what it is. So I think the next thing is a sort of publicity campaign to try and overcome that. So essentially, I am still a councillor, but I'm an independent councillor now. My term of office finishes in May. I had considered standing as something else, but I don't think I will really. One or two people have suggested I do. But of course, that will affect, we'll split the left. Well, if I get any votes at all, it will split the Labour votes and let the Tories in. So I'm not. That's not something I really want to pursue. So I suggest I stop then, and you just people ask me questions if they want to.
Okay, thanks, Pam. John, do you want to make your comments, please?
Yeah, well, after Tina's excellent lead off about the general situation in Labour Party, there's not much to say. I've been a member for 50 years now, and I've seen the nature of the party change, and I think we have to understand that parties like Labour, that were originally formed to give working people representation in Parliament, they actually reflect what's going on in society, even if it's in a distorted way. And because of the lack of any class struggle, in particular since our miners' strike in 84, 85 was defeated, and the working class as activities been at a low ebb, the Labour Party has reflected that, and during that period it was absolutely stuffed full of right-wing careerists, of people who had done nothing other than be political advisors to MPs and things like that. And so its class nature started to change rapidly. I mean, I remember in the days when I first joined the Labour Party, my local MP in North East Derbyshire was a character called Tom Swain, who was an ex-miner who on budget setting days would turn up to Parliament dressed as a miner in working clothes. Now, the Labour Party MPs are people in shiny suits and pointy shoes and brill cream hair. That whole class, and even the left, is not really of an industrial working class base, with few exceptions. And so when Corbyn came along, Tina's right, that was seen as some sort of coming of the Messiah. And a lot of people rushed into the Labour Party, admittedly over 500,000 strong, but then people, a lot of the official left were under this illusion that this meant we were suddenly a mass movement. But the majority of these people joining never got active in parties. It was still the same 20 or 30 people turning up, and a lot of them were mainly concentrated in cities and particularly around university cities. The sort of places I come from, the former coalfields that have been abandoned for decades and decades, the Labour Party's hardly even a shell. It consists of a few councillors and the wives who are on the council and their families, and a tiny little caucus of these sort of people. And for 50 odd years, Labour has been losing headway in these areas. The majorities have slowly been eroded, and even under Corbyn, these areas recorded losses of votes purely because they've been abandoned. And if I go back 50 years, there was the Labour government of 1964 closed 300 pits, 300 mines were closed because Labour was going to introduce the white heat of technology, was the phrase they used. Very similar to what we're hearing now about the green industrial revolution. Well, in mining areas, nobody's even seen that white heat of technology of 50 years ago. They're destitute, they've got boarded up shops, they've got drug dealers, they've got antisocial behaviour, and that's it. And so when along comes Corbyn promising, this green revolution, it's hardly surprising that these areas just didn't believe him. Plus, as Tina says, his constant backing off and retreating, into parliamentary games with his and trying to keep the peace with his right-wingers meant that he was not seen in any way as a radical force. In that, he was very much seen as part of the establishment, especially over Brexit. And I think, the nearest analogy we've got to your situation with Trump is Brexit, because working class people in the main in former industrial areas tended to vote to leave the European Union, not because they were racist in any great shakes or anything like. It was the one chance to give the establishment a kick. But a lot of the Labour Party members who aren't from this industrial base, and this is what we have to understand. A recent survey showed that over 70% of Labour Party members are from the top social tiers of white-collar workers. They don't represent industrial workers as such, and their attitude towards working class Leave voters were, you're all thick, you're all racist, you're all this. you're all right-wingers. And so it's, the referendum in 2016 then became the cause of Corbyn's defeat, if you like, in 2019, because these people thought, well, if Labour can't honour a referendum, how can we believe whatever we say? And there's a myth that these areas actually voted Tory. The 2019 election, Labour's vote fell by almost 3 million votes, and the Tories only went up by 300,000. So that's the sort of scenario that led to Corbyn's defeat. But the left have to be held, the official parliamentary left have to be held 100% responsible. As Tina says, just appeasement, 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 unity with people who never wanted unity at all. And when Corbyn fell from grace, then, and Starmer, who's only been an MP for 5 years, very much part of the establishment, the former director of public prosecutions, a real establishment figure, when he becomes leader, there's a mass purge and a mass attack upon the left. And the left are totally paralysed they're like rabbits in the headlights of an oncoming juggernaut. And it's become that, we fight back by passing resolutions in support of Jeremy Corbyn, which then gets the left expelled or suspended, with no solidarity coming back that way. Or else you're expelled on trumped-up charges. I'm now, I can say, I'm a little bit behind, Pam. I've not been expelled. I'm suspended now for the second time. I was suspended in 2016 for challenging the character who stood against Corbyn in the leadership when he tried to hijack part of our miners' strike. I was suspended for that. And now I'm suspended because what we also have to understand is out of the woodwork have come all these, I refer to them as local fifth columnists, the most rabid, right-wing, awful creatures are now running rampant through every stage of the Labour Party. And so people are being excluded from meetings that they should be at. People are being taken off lists for candidates for either councils, mayors, MPs, things like that, all aided locally by this real right-wing. I'm supposed to have bullied a 23-year-old marathon runner who switched off my Zoom so I couldn't participate in a local constituency meeting. And when I protested, this marathon runner claims that me, a frail pensioner miner whose lungs are full of dust, has bullied him, and so I'm suspended and I'm about to be expelled purely because of things. And I'm, and this is happening to left-wingers up and down with not a peep from the official leadership of the left, either in the trade unions or in the Labour Party. And I think, in a way, and I'll finish on this, we have to give up on the Labour Party. I don't think it's a fight worth fighting at the moment. What we need is a movement. We need to build a movement in communities, in trade unions, all politicising food banks, politicising community campaigns, so we can start the fight back from the bottom up. And then that might have an impact on what happens inside a party like Labour. But to be a purely electoral machine, to be purely about getting MPs into well-paid jobs in Parliament, within left-wing, right-wing or whatever, is no longer the answer. In a way, we've got to rebuild our movement. We've got to start demanding things from our trade union leaders. We just had, as this pandemic has run rampant and nurses have been called to make sacrifices, 850 of them have died from COVID in this pandemic. The Tory government have said they're only going to get a 1% pay increase, which actually means a pay cut because the pay's been frozen for years. The leadership of their union has called, and this is unbelievable, I have seen some rubbish trade union campaigns, but the way we are supposed to fight on behalf of the nurses is to stand on our doorsteps on the 11th of March at 6 p.m. and give a slow hand clap. Now that's going to shake the ruling class to its foundations, ain't it? I think when it comes to post-COVID and we can take to the streets, that's where we start the fight. That's where we start the fight back. But without a campaign, without that grassroots movement, just wasting time passing resolutions in Labour Party meetings, singing "Oh Come By Our Jeremy Corbyn." I'm sorry if that sounds a bit negative, but I've had enough of it. I want to get stuck into a fight, and I want to have a private word with this fella I'm supposed to be bullying, to be honest.
I feel there is so much in what all three of you described that I think we can relate to here, even though the Democratic Party is not a Labour Party. Some similar processes in terms of the fact that the base of the Democratic Party was more oriented towards the working class or blue collar workers at one time, and now its base is the same people that you described, sort of, white collar, technology sector, financial sector, things like this. So, but I want to just get back to some of the things that Tina said that I just are on my mind. So one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot since we've been during the pandemic, I've done a lot of reading about the civil rights movement of the 50s and the 60s, and how it was attacked by the state, this FBI surveillance, the COINTEL programs, and all of that, and you were describing this, this witch hunt against Corbyn, the witch hunt against socialists. That was supposedly, but it was cloaked in denialism and cloaked in anti-Semitism. I don't know how, Tina, you said, and again, all three of you are basically saying, how can we learn from this? Because we know that whenever a movement, a social movement, whether it's led by socialists or someone else, is beginning to have some success and actually becomes a threat to the structure of society and to the capitalists, they're going to attack. And whether they do it in words, in the form of a witch hunt and taking people down, or whether they do it in the form of the police state coming in and murdering people, or they also use agents. There's all these things that they do. We know they have all these tools. They've been using them forever, and it sounds like, in the case. So one of my questions I have is, you didn't see it. No one could see that coming, but if you could go back in time to when this witch hunt against Corbyn began, and this witch hunt based on anti-Semitism, what would you do differently? That's my first question. I don't even know how, as sort of activists, we can prepare for these things, but you have to. Okay, that's my first question. It sounds like it's been absolutely necessary to defend yourselves and to be engaged in all of these sort of legal proceedings within the Labour Party. But what has been the perspective? How is this all seen by sort of workers in general, who I imagine are fairly just disgusted by it? It's the sort of thing people would be confused by and disgusted by. So, it has taken a tremendous amount of energy just for people to defend themselves So, I mean, there's really not been much left to do what John was talking about. John Dunn was talking about, which is sort of starting over from scratch and taking whatever shreds are left of the Labour Party that is worth preserving and rebuilding a new movement. I don't know, but it seems like there's not much left to spend time on that. So that's the second question. Tina, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate your talking about how important it is to avoid the Messiah syndrome. I have another word for it. I call it, I don't believe in putting anybody on a revolutionary pedestal. I don't care who they are, current, past, or present, right? That's just a mistake that happens over and over again. We'll just take a quick look and see. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks.
Most of you live in societies where the main political party set the agenda for the rest of the world to a great extent. The UK and the US are huge in their influence through the media, largely, I think, on what happens in other countries. Tina, you mentioned Tony Blair. What his effect was here was that the Swedish capitalist-friendly socialists, they were social democrats, they weren't socialists, haven't been socialist for many, many decades, found that they could throw out, as I say, most of socialism and bring in sort of second-rate capitalism in the party, which they didn't understand. I'll give you one very simple example, which I still find unbelievable. The premier at the time, the prime minister, Göran Persson, decided to go modern. And he took a large portion of the publicly owned pension funds. And because it was so modern, he invested them in the stock market. Need I say more? All of them, I mean, an entire fund with millions and millions and millions of krona. Anyway, that's one point. It really does have a very bad, countries which follow what's in their own policies, what's happening in the US and the UK, make enormous mistakes. When it comes to anti-Semitism in Israel, I think Israel's actually becoming kosher even in certain halal countries. When you think, one of the things that Trump and Pompeo achieved was actually whitewashing Israel's policies to the extent that a number of Arab-speaking countries are now friends with them. I mean, obviously, there are economic reasons for this underlying it, but it makes it very difficult for people like Pam, or I'm not in a public position, so I can say what I want, but to actually criticize Israel's policies in public makes it extremely difficult and not be called an anti-Semite. Yeah, those are the 2 points I really wanted. Oh no, the Messiah thing. It's all over. It's a result of what I call time journalism. When they talk about, in the 70s and 80s, when they talked about the UK, they would say Thatcher. When they talked about the US, they would say Reagan, and they would mean the whole country. What I'm saying is that the Messiah syndrome is something that's been a part of Western society for decades.
First of all, on this whole issue of the Messiah syndrome, we really have to take a look at Hollywood and the like TV programs, movies, and stuff that come out of Hollywood and the same industry elsewhere in the world. And some people deny that the movies that are made and the TV shows that are made are political, but they're totally political. And everything is portrayed, every problem, whether it's serial killers or whatever, even some where there's a political and more overtly, formally political issue. The total solution is some great hero. And that definitely has an effect on how people see things. So I wanted to comment, first of all, John had compared Brexit to the vote for Trump. And I want to make one point about the US. And, you know, I think that this might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but not very much of one, to say that there is a crisis in the US working class, in that 40% of voters from union households voted for Trump. And when you consider that the overwhelming majority of Black and Latino union voters did not vote for Trump, that would mean probably the majority of white voters from union households voted for Trump. When and his whole appeal was bullying, racism, and xenophobia, chauvinism. And at the present time, you're going to see, and it's already starting, the Republicans are going to be counterattacking the Democrats around the issue of immigration. And I do think that if Biden eases up on some of the more brutal, cruel, sadistic policies that Trump had instituted, that you will see more immigration from Latin America into the United States. And I think that the Republicans will have some success around that issue. And the only way that you can answer that, to me, is to raise the need for international working class unity, not in some abstract, idealistic way, but just, for instance, and I'm coming to the question of the Labor Party, but I just want to make this point about the United States. For instance, there was a strike of General Motors about a year ago here in the United States. Workers at a GM plant in Mexico expressed solidarity. What was the response of the UAW leadership here was to call for work to be taken from those workers and brought back to the United States. But there's no way, or now you see the attempt to organize at one particular warehouse of Amazon. There's no way that these giant conglomerates will be defeated just on the industrial plane, just in one country. And I think that workers here in the United States, a lot of them understand that. That's why, actually, some of them have turned to xenophobia, keep them all out, because the alternative of international solidarity in action, not just in words, but in action, is not being presented. And that brings me to one question that I would have for Tina and the other comrades regarding the Labor Party there and Corbyn. Because as far as I understand it, the whole campaign against Brexit, it was never really clearly raised. This is my understanding anyway. It was never really clearly raised that, look, the British working class alone by themselves cannot advance their own interests just by themselves. Because if they try to, the more they succeed, the more British capital will leave Britain and go to other countries. And so what's needed is an all EU campaign for a minimum wage, minimal certain standards for social programs, and so on. And as far as I understand it, that was never raised by Corbyn or by those who oppose Brexit. But it seems to me that that would have been an important issue. And so when we talk about drawing some lessons, if you stay in the Labour Party or if you build something new, I would like to hear the comrades' view of whether or not that should not be a central issue in whatever you're doing. This is just John was talking about leaving the Labour Party, or at least building movements outside of the Labour Party. And the closest thing we have here in the United States to the Labour Party is the unions. And I think a similar state of affairs exists here, where you cannot just ignore the unions. But I think at this point, and you cannot just ignore the official structures of the unions. But I think at this point, campaigns outside of the official structures within the working class are necessary and at times are possible. But obviously that means that also that we cannot just ignore the official structures. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily the same in the Labour Party, but it's just what John makes me think about. But finally, I just want to say regarding internationalism, I've heard Chris Williamson's name raised a couple of times, and from what I understand, he's quite prominent in the Labour left. And I do think that, I don't think this is necessarily the place and time, but I do think that some of his more questionable positions do need to be discussed at some point. So that's my, does anybody else have any comments? Well, maybe you other comrades who have already spoken, Tina or Pam or John, you'd like to.
Tina's got her hands up, I think. I think she's waving. Yes, she is, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, unless somebody else has any questions or comments, I can reply to a few things. I thought it was a really good discussion, actually. I think you're, starting with John, I think you're spot on in the lack of internationalism, which is only a small point I tried to make at the end. On Brexit, absolutely. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn is actually anti-EU. He's held a position for decades, which is sort of the official Labour left, trade union left position, which is, you know, the European Union is the big exploiting bosses club, which it is. And that's why we have to get out of it and then have the, you know, the little exploiting club that is the UK government, which is exactly the same, just in smaller, and you don't have any chance of, you know, using it to work with your brothers and sisters across Europe. This is unfortunately, there's a really widespread understanding of internationalism, unfortunately, in the British left and wider, I'm sure as well, which is, you know, if you're a real internationalist, you have to pull out of these big bosses, clubs, etc., and, you know, build your own thing. I mean, there's now, I don't know if comrades are aware of this, it's Scottish independence is really on the cards again, and this is a lot of working class people in Scotland are under the illusion they can have, I mean, there's been a Scottish Socialist Party, which has had its own problems, but they've peddled the lie for years and years. You can have a socialist Scotland, you know, as part, there's this British capitalism next door, but you can have 3 million people living in socialism. What kind of socialism could that possibly be? You know, it's ridiculous. It's a real lack of understanding what socialism is, and that it must be international. I mean, that's what we should have learned from the disaster of the Soviet Union. You know, you cannot have socialism in one country. Can't even have it on one continent. It does not work. So that definitely was a huge problem, I think, in the problems with Corbyn and why Brexit was lost. There was never any attempt to present a positive vision of that you don't have to go with this option or that option in the referendum. You don't have to choose between the smaller butcher and the bigger butcher. You know, we should have put our third option forward of working class unity, you know, but that was never even tried. He personally was, you know, in favor of Brexit, and he had been for some time, and then he was forced, and did it very badly, to go with a yes vote, you know, with a no, you know, no, how was it phrased? I can't even remember how it was phrased, but he was basically forced to say yes to British unity, you know, stay in the European Union. And he did it, he was so unconvincing and so unconvinced that, you know, that was a very bad move from trying to go that way. But again, it's not just Corbyn, it's unions as well, as John quite rightly pointed out. You know, they actually have no interest in international cooperation unions. You know, they actually, most of them are based on, yes, defending their workers against other workers in other industries, but also in other countries. There've been limited attempts to overcome this, I think, in Europe with the European Union, the ETUC, European Trade Union Congress, but this is very, it's limited by this particular fact that, you know, you have to you have to play your workers against those workers, etc. When clearly, yes, our interest, the interest of the workers below, is that of course, we all have the same wages. That's how you stop, you know, exploiting people, and that's how you stop, you know, workers, sort of companies taking their business to Lithuania, etc. If they earn the same as us, you know, they won't do that. They can't do it. But the unions that represent these people actually have very little interest in doing that. So, you know, it's important to be in a union, etc. But they're also part of the problem, aren't they? The way they're organized and the way they're structured, etc. So I think it's actually what we need is quite outside either the Labour Party and outside the unions. It's actually a sort of a Marxist trend, an international Marxist socialist, you know, method of organizing the working class independently of all these you know, social democratic parties, or the unions as well, who have their own interests, etc. But it's very, very difficult how to do that, and how to, you know, build the movement that John Donne quite rightly says. I mean, I'm not wedded to the Labour Party at all. I think there's a struggle going on, and John said as well, it's quite rightly, it's a reflection of the class struggle. So if something's happening, it's happening in the Labour Party for sure. So you have, you know, if things kick off again, we'll have to go in it, or try to go in it, and start and try to win the battle there as well as in outside. But you know, I wouldn't recommend it for anybody's sanity to join the Labour Party now. It's awful. It's, you know, there's no democracy, there's no meetings hardly, etc. So it's truly awful. But I would you know, we do, in the organizations that I'm a member of, we do encourage comrades to stay and fight if they can. If you're just staying and keep your head down because you don't want to be expelled or anything like that, and there's really no point. I mean, then you might as well just leave. You know, there's nothing to be gained. But you know, I'm always, you know, you can't run away from the class war. I mean, you cannot fight it, but you can't run away from it. So the building the movement is tricky. I mean, in Britain we have the additional problem of the electoral system. And while I'm arguing against, you know, putting everything into winning elections, it is a reason why I think why left parties outside the Labour Party in Britain don't really take off. And they tend to be sects, really, organized around a particular program and a particular set of leaders. And if you don't agree with that, you're out. Any attempts to try and build something bigger have, I think, always failed in Britain, really. Not so much in Germany. We have a different electoral system. It's got its own problems. But in terms of building something outside the Labour Party in Britain is a tricky undertaking. If we do it, then I think we should do it along clearly, a program of socialism. What are we actually fighting for? And I think a lot of people refuse to do that. They think that's not the way. It's always off-putting. People don't want to talk about those things, etc. And so, nothing really happens, because those people who will try to build something else, it tends to be, as I say, either on a particular line, often unfortunately Trotskyist groups, then you have to agree with all the programming details, or they're trying to build a Labour Party Mark II, with a really sort of wishy-washy program, that doesn't offend anybody. We're not going to speak about anything, too serious. We don't want to abolish. We don't want to say anything about abolishing the monarchy or something like that. That just puts people off. They know it's needed, but they don't want to scare people. So what they build is then, just a smaller Labour Party with the same rubbish program and just really, really small. So that there's very little point in doing that. So building a movement, yes, but I think it would have to be something quite, radical and something quite that actually fights for what is necessary. And unfortunately, I can't see at the moment, with the working class struggle being quite so low, that a lot of people would be prepared to do that. Just very briefly, I think, yes, it's important to understand that while Corbyn himself wasn't a real threat, I think, and the working class, the British working class, wasn't a real threat, and a low level of the class struggle. Certainly, the BDS movement was, and still is, a threat to Israel and to Israel's image and standing in the world. And that we got into a situation, really sort of early 90s, where if Israel wants help against Libya, against Syria and stuff, the rest of the Western world comes along and helps, and defends Israel's right to exist. And that has been challenged rather effectively by the BDS movement. And I think a lot of what's been happening now comes from this attempt by Israel to do away with its critics and undermine its critics, etc. And if I can recommend to comrades a wonderful book, which is quite old actually, it's about 30 years old. It's called A Very British Coup by Chris Mullins. Fantastic read. It's absolutely hilarious, and it describes what happens if a socialist accidentally gets elected prime minister of Britain, and what the secret state will do to get rid of him. And it doesn't even touch on the whole Israel question. That wasn't even an issue then. But if you put that on top, and and you can just imagine what they all threw at Jeremy Corbyn. It's a really good novel, as well as you read it after Corbyn's election. How did he guess that would happen? But of course, that's the normal thing that happens when you get a socialist to get into number 10. What would we've done different? I mean, to be honest, I've known John Dan and Pam now pretty much for the same length of time, 2016, 2017, when the witch hunt really took off. And some of us didn't take it lying down. Some of us stood up, and, we're here, and there's maybe 200-300 others who actually, spoke out and said what needs to be done. Don't pretend you buy the lie that criticizing Israel makes you an anti-Semite. It's not true. That's I think the big lie that has led to our downfall. That's the big lie that led to Corbyn's downfall. He pretended, although he very much knew that was rubbish, he pretended that, oh yes, this is true. There's lots of anti-Semites in the Labour Party. We must do something about that. That's in effect was what got him. And if we could go back, we could scream louder or whatever, but it's I'm not sure much of the left would do things differently. I'm not sure Corbyn even would do different things differently. I'm not sure he's the type. He'd still believe that to win elections you just have to lie a little bit as well and pretend to be different, and then perhaps you can sneak in, and then we unveil ourselves as the socialists. It made very little sense. unfortunately.
Yeah, I just wanted to return to Cheryl's question, what we would do differently. I think what it illustrates is the limitations of social democracy. We had a lot of new people come into the Labour Party, many very raw, very new to politics, hadn't really got much theoretical understanding of previous events or of previous history. I know in my own local area, we actually organised discussion groups because the level of education was so poor. But so many people actively resisted learning anything. No, we've got to live in the moment. No, we've got to go out on the streets, blah, 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 which of course ultimately contributed to the downfall of the Labour left as it stands at the moment. I mean, the thing with Jeremy Corbyn, constant apologising all the time. There was the various there was a famous painting on a wall in London. I don't know if comrades are aware of that, which was again a criticism of capitalism, because one or two of the bankers in it looked Jewish. It was declared anti-Semitic and it was taken down, and Corbyn apologised for it, even though there wasn't really any indication it was anti-Semitic at all. But I mean, I think in terms of what we would do next time, I think it's a question of whether people are prepared to learn from experiences, because I think a lot of life teaches you. But I think also we've got to be looking at upcoming movements in Britain. I mean, there seems to be a strike wave developing that's really going to explode after the lockdown finishes. There's all sorts of isolated things, but you can see this sort of resistance developing. In terms of another organisation, obviously we've a few choices at the moment, like Tina, I'm involved in Labour Left Alliance and Labour Against the Witch Hunt and various other bits to do with it, because I can't be involved in the local Labour Party now, and even the left has collapsed really. And then there's Chris Williamson's organisation Resist. There's lots of different organisations and the like that. And at the moment, I suppose people are picking and choosing. I think my involvement in the Labour Left Alliance is in the hope that we will keep left ideas together, so that when situations and events happen, we're going to be ready now to actually analyse and explain why we went wrong last time, where we went wrong, and hopefully people will. Let's hope they'll have a more hardened attitude in the future. So it's just difficult to say. Corbyn, I don't know if comrades know, but when they were deciding who was going to stand, which of the left MPs, the socialist campaign groups, were going to stand as the leader, it was just his turn. They'd all had a turn, and his was next. And unfortunately, was possibly the wrong person. We would need somebody far more forceful and far less nice. I mean, he was popular because he was nice. He wanted a different kind of politics, a gentle kind of politics, but it just doesn't work. You're facing the British ruling class, who probably one of the most unscrupulous ruling classes in the world. So I think in some respects he perhaps was just the wrong person, really, despite all his good ways. But I think what I find worrying is we're talking about things like this peace and justice campaign, the illusions that people have, the excitement around. And when I actually feel that Corbyn let us down now, I have nothing like the opinion I might have had of him at one time. But you're not allowed to say that. If you start criticising Corbyn online, they go feel like a bunch of hyenas. So I think it's this question of denial, really. So are people going to learn, really? I think that's the that's what we would do differently next time. We'd hope that experience would have taught.
I mean, the points that have come up in discussion, each one of them could form a separate discussion. But I think one of the things, we've been very critical of Corbyn and his movement, but I think one thing we should recognise is it had a potential that when he first broke onto the scene, however accidentally, to think that, I addressed a rally in Sheffield on a Friday evening, a wet Friday evening of 8,000 to 10,000 people strong. And that was happening all over the country. And I think it's that more than Corbyn himself that the ruling class were afraid of. Then they started the coup against him, and then he started retreating. And that's when that movement, that campaign, that impetus, I hate to use the word momentum, that's become tarnished now, but that's when that were lost. There were meetings where the mood was absolutely electric. And I think if Corbyn had actually stood up and said, go home and arm yourself and storm the citadel, it could have happened. And all that dissipated. And now we are where we are. We're in retreat. On the question that Cheryl posed of what would we have done differently then, I think the three of us here, as Tina said, couldn't have done anything much differently to what we were doing. But, we were sort of straws in the wind. The whole of the left were just content to hold candlelit vigils and build effigies of Corbyn, and that was it. And the trouble with movements is when they start to dissipate, something fills that void and you get a reaction. And that's the danger now if we don't start putting the pieces back together. And, if people want to stay in the Labour Party, if people are out, we have to bridge those comrades and actually stop. I mean, Tina's right. All these, different varieties, the Fourth International, second removed, and where people and the cousins form a great revolutionary movement. The days of those things are gone. We've got to reinvigorate the class struggle. And Pam's right. We're seeing little bits of it starting to happen. It don't get reported on the media, but also a good thing that's happening over it, and I don't know whether it happens in America, is there's all sorts of socialist alternate media coming to the fore. It's only very small and only in its very infancy, but we're now getting a media, and in a way the pandemic's helped us to get that message across.
Just to respond to what John just said, in a way, this meeting and a lot of other meetings like this are very visible examples of exactly what you're talking about, John. I never heard of Zoom before COVID hit. And we are seeing, I'm going to far more meetings now than I used to a few years ago, just right here in my living room. And I think a lot of other people are also. I think as far as what needs to be done differently, if we agree that internationalism as a concrete issue, not just in some vague, nice sounding moralisms, but concretely, that it sounds to me that was not really raised during the Brexit campaign. And maybe that's something to be considered, like how to make that concretely, that neither the US working class nor the British working class can advance on their own, nor do we have any common interest with our own capitalist class. And concretely, what can we do to unite across borders? The other thing I've been thinking a lot about, Tina, what you were saying about that the sole purpose, our sole purpose must not be to just win elections. And here in the United States, obviously the central question for us is, how can a working class party develop and what would its function be? And I think as it develops, it would overwhelmingly be a minority party that in the main, maybe except for a few cases here and there at the local level, would not win elections. But the main point is that it would be an organizing center for workers, both to help them organize in action and also to draw the lessons. And maybe that's relevant to that whole question in Britain about the potential role of a Labour Party. just finally, that was very interesting. I think, Pam, you were saying about a strike wave possibly developing there. I think that was you that commented on that. And I think that's one possibility for here in the United States. You have seen a slight uptick in the number of strikes. Then you're seeing that organizing campaign at Amazon, which is in some ways a bit different from recent organizing campaigns in the US, just because Amazon is different from even from General Motors in a lot of different ways. And so you could see the beginnings of industrial action here in the United States, on a wider scale. That could be a revival of the working class movement here. But that's something that I think we really need further discussion of, is how, on what basis will the working class start, at least a section of it, start to cohere and move and assert itself independently. So with that, if there are there, and also I'd like to just thank Pam, thank Tina for, everybody should take note of what I see your hand there. Yeah, everybody should just take note of what she mentioned in the chat window about the meetings that they have there on Thursdays and also on Fridays. So I've copied that down and I will send it around. So, okay, Pam and then Tina.
I was just going to say, some of these strikes, they're winning them as well. There was a significant win at the Scunthorpe Steelworks over electricians' pay rates. They won it, and the Barnoldswick Rolls-Royce workers won as well. So, I mean, these little victories, I think, can grow. There's massive support now for decent pay rises for NHS workers. So it's just, I think we've just got to focus on where we're winning, not where we're losing. That was all I wanted to say. Yeah.
Thanks, Pam. Tina?
Yeah, I was just going to draw attention to those meetings that we've been going for about half a year now with these regular education sessions, and we do get international visitors as well. I think 6 p.m. our time is probably not too bad for comrades, so it's early, it's morning in the US, but I think discussing ideas together internationally and discussing what is actually socialism and what are we fighting for is a really necessary step towards sort of building any kind of international organization or international understanding even of where we are and where our movements are. We've been so divided in the last few decades that it's we've been talking about the First and Second International. Actually, these guys, hundreds of them traveled across continents for weeks of meetings, and they just sat together, people from America, Germany, Britain, etc. They actually met physically. They had to travel for days, for weeks to get together. And now we have Zoom. We could actually do it quite easily to talk to each other and educate each other and start talking about how we can organize. So it'd be good if comrades come along and stuff and input what's going on where you are.
Thanks again to Tina, Pam, and John for their contributions.